Edward, Charlie and the chase. The engines on the Fat Controller's railway are always very busy. They all work hard together and they always get the job done. Sometimes their adventures can be full of fun and excitement. Edward is the oldest engine on the railway. He knows he's not as young as the other engines, but wishes he could be fun again. One day, Edward popped into Napford Station. The Fat Controller was waiting for him. "Edward, I have an important job for you," he said. Edward was excited. "My car needs to be repaired," the Fat Controller explained. "A mechanic from the Sodor Recovery Unit will be at Maron Station waiting for you. I need you to collect my car from Mavewaite Station and take it straight to Maron." This made Edward think for a moment. "Why can't Butch help, sir?" he asked. "Butch is unwell today," said the Fat Controller. "His engine won't start properly. Now on your way, please, Edward." "Yes, sir," smiled Edward, and he puffed away. Edward soon reached Mavewaite Station, where Harvey had just loaded the car onto the flatbed. Edward was coupled up to the flatbed. "There you go, Edward," smiled Harvey. "All ready to go." "Thank you, Harvey," whistled Edward. Harvey puffed back to the workstation. While Edward's crew checked the car was fixed on properly, Hank puffed up alongside. "Howdy, Edward," he said. "What on earth is that on your flatbed?" "That's the Fat Controller's car," said Edward. "I'm taking it to Maron Station for it to be fixed." Hank snorted. "That's no fun," he sniffed. "My train is more fun than that." "What do you mean?" asked Edward. "I'm pulling tow wagons," explained Hank. "Workmen are repairing the road entrance to the airport." Edward didn't like this at all. "My job is just as fun as yours," he huffed. "Rubbish," chortled Hank. "Your jobs are never exciting. Old engines never get the best jobs anymore. You should know that by now." Before Edward could answer, Hank puffed away. "You're too old to be fun anymore, Edward," called Hank as he puffed down the line. After Hank had gone, Edward felt upset. He knew he was an old engine, and he knew his jobs were different to the other engines. "Maybe I am too old to be fun," he sighed sadly. Just then Charlie puffed up. He had just delivered trucks to the quarry. He was feeling very pleased with himself. "Hey, Edward, you'll never guess what happened at the quarry," he beamed happily. But Edward was too upset to listen. He felt very sad. Charlie was surprised. He had never seen Edward look unhappy before. "What's wrong, Edward?" he asked. Edward told Charlie what Hank had said. "He says I'm too old to be fun anymore," he said, "and that old engines like me don't get the best jobs anymore." Charlie could not believe what he had heard. "Stuff and nonsense," he puffed. "You're never too old to be fun." "Really?" asked Edward, feeling the same still. "Of course not," said Charlie. "Young or old, you can always still have fun." "Come along, Edward," said Edward's driver. "Time we were off." Then Edward had an idea. "Why don't you come with me, Charlie?" he asked. "Then this job will be more fun." Charlie beamed from buffer to buffer. "Of course I will," he smiled. "I'm ready to go." "Very well then," said Edward. "To Maron Station." And both engines puffed away together. As Edward and Charlie puffed along, Edward told Charlie all about his adventures. He told Charlie about the time he saved James from disaster after some boys had meddled with his controls. "How exciting," said Charlie. "I wish I was there to see it." "It used a lot of puff, I can tell you," said Edward. "Have you an adventure to tell?" "Certainly do," said Charlie. He told Edward about how he first arrived on the railway and had gotten into trouble while trying to move some trucks. "Wow," said Edward. "That sounds like a sight to see." Charlie felt pleased to be with Edward. "See, Edward," he said, "you're not boring, you are fun." This made Edward feel much better. Meanwhile, at Maron Station, Bertie the bus was feeling impatient. Edward had not arrived and he wanted to get going. But the mechanic was still on the platform. hurry up, Bertie tooted. It's time to go. But what about Edward? The mechanic asked. You can come back later, said Bertie. I'll bring you back. The mechanic looked at his watch and decided to come back in a while. I'll check on Butch, then come back, he decided. So he left the platform and climbed on board Bertie. Then Bertie vroomed away, just as Edward and Charlie arrived. Edward looked around, but the mechanic was gone. Where has he gone? He wondered. He left on Bertie, said Duck. He said he'll be back later. Edward was surprised. Now he was worried. What will the fat controller say? He groaned. Don't worry, Edward, said Charlie. I'm sure we can still get the car fixed. Edward wasn't sure how. But then, as he saw Bertie race away, another idea came to him. Charlie, gather up all your puff, he said. We're going on a chase. Charlie gasped. A chase? He cried. Wow, let's go! Both engines whistled goodbye to Duck and set chase at once. Duck watched as they sped away. Be careful, he called. Don't damage the car. Edward and Charlie raced as fast as they could along the tracks. They soon caught up with Bertie and tried to get him to stop. Edward whistled as loud as he could. Stop, Bertie! Stop! But Bertie was too far ahead to hear him, and he didn't stop. The mechanic looked back and saw Edward and Charlie not far behind. Edward! He cried. He's after us! Bertie heard this, but didn't take any notice. I have a timetable to keep, he said, and I aim to keep it. So he kept going. Edward groaned. It's no good, he won't stop, he said. Let me try, puffed Charlie. So Charlie blew a loud whistle and shouted as loud as he could. Stop, Bertie! Stop! Bertie heard this but refused to stop. I've no time to waste on late engines, he fumed. Bertie disappeared round the bend and into the countryside. Edward and Charlie puffed straight on. Then there was trouble. Edward shuddered and shook. His driver applied the brakes. Whoa, Edward, he called. Stop! So Edward came to a stop and Charlie stopped beside him. Edward's driver checked the tender and came back with a long face. You've run out of water, Edward, he said. We'll never catch up with Bertie now. Edward was now very worried. Now the fat controller's car wouldn't be fixed. Then Edward had a thought. Charlie, I need your help, he said. I need you to catch up with Bertie. You're faster than me, so you'll have more of a chance of stopping him. Charlie wasn't so sure. I don't know, Edward, he wheezed. Bertie is faster than me. I'll never be able to stop him. Please, Charlie, pleaded Edward. You're the only one who can help me now. We can always tell the signalman to take a message, suggested Charlie's driver. The drivers agreed, and Charlie decided to help. Right away, Edward, he said. But first, I'll help you to a water tower. Charlie puffed and pulled and panted as he heaved Edward to the water tower. Edward's driver put the hose into the tender. Get your puff back, Edward, said Charlie. Then catch up as soon as you can. And Charlie puffed away. Good luck, Charlie, called Edward, as Charlie disappeared into the distance. Charlie puffed up to the nearest signal box and told the signalman what was happening. So the signalman telephoned the station master, who then telephoned the fat controller. So the fat controller telephoned the bus depot and explained the situation. He'll be at the airport soon, said the inspector. You'll probably catch him there. So the inspector got into his car and set off. After a long journey, he picked up the fat controller and they were off to find Bertie. Charlie was taking on water when the signalman came back to see him. The fat controller and the inspector are on their way, he said. Get to the airport as fast as you can. Yes, sir, said Charlie. Edward puffed up alongside Charlie and both engines were once more ready to go. Come on, Edward, whistled Charlie. To the airport. Let's go, whistled Edward, and both engines set off together. They puffed through tunnels and over bridges and went up Gordon's Hill. Soon they saw the inspector and the Fat Controller in the car ahead of them. "Now the chase is on," said Charlie. Edward agreed. Bertie was soon near the airport. He couldn't wait to have a rest. "I can have a nice long rest when I get there," he thought to himself. But as he got closer, he could see a man waving a red flag. He was from the airport. Bertie's driver was surprised. "What's all this?" he thought. "Stop!" called the man. But Bertie didn't want to stop. "I'll be late if I do stop," he moaned. "I have to go on." So instead of stopping, Bertie drove right past the red flag. The man was cross. Then he saw the inspector's car drive up towards him. "He didn't stop," grumbled the man. "Climb inside," said the inspector. "We'll catch him." So the man climbed inside and they set off again. Bertie drove into the airport feeling pleased with himself. Luckily the roads were resurfaced and flattened. Edward and Charlie puffed into the airport station. "There he is," cried Edward. Bertie came to a stop just at the platform entrance. As all the passengers climbed out of Bertie, the inspector's car pulled up. The inspector and the Fat Controller came to see Bertie. They were cross. "You, Bertie, have been a very naughty bus," said the Fat Controller. "You had no right to tell the mechanic to leave Maron Station. I hope you realise the trouble you have caused us." "The mechanic was waiting to repair the Fat Controller's car," the inspector continued. "You wasted a lot of our time chasing you, and I believe you owe Edward, the mechanic, and the Fat Controller an apology." Bertie felt silly and very bad. "Sorry everyone," he sighed. "I just didn't want to be late." Everyone just looked at Bertie. The inspector decided to teach Bertie a lesson. "For the next few days," he said, "you will stay at the depot until you can learn to be patient." "And learn never to ignore red flags," said the man holding the red flag. The mechanic walked onto the platform. "Now you're here, Edward," he said, "I can start work straight away." Once the car had been rolled off the flatbed and onto the road, the mechanic went to work. While he did that, Edward spoke to Charlie. "I must admit, Charlie," he said, "today was a more fun day than I thought it could be." "I couldn't agree more," smiled Charlie. Then Hank puffed up to them. He was puzzled when he saw Edward smiling. "What's up with you?" he asked. "I've had the most exciting chase ever," explained Edward, "and it's all thanks to Charlie and Bertie. Now what do you think of me?" Hank was surprised. He knew then he had been rude to Edward. "I'm sorry I was rude to you, Edward," he said. "I guess I was wrong about you." Edward was pleased to hear this. "You see, Edward," said Charlie, "you may be old, but you're still a fun engine." Edward felt pleased. He couldn't think of anything to say, except for one thing, when he looked at Bertie. "Bertie won't be having any more races for a while," he chuckled. Everyone laughed and laughed, and Bertie just sulked.